Okay, this is Rob Blum. This is my fourth amateurishly produced, but hopefully insightful podcast about the Hamas war in Gaza. In this podcast, I'm going to discuss the laws of war as they apply to what we have seen or are likely to see, um, in the coming days. I studied international law at the University of Chicago back in 1983. So I'm admittedly a bit rusty, but I've gotten reasonably up to speed on this the past couple of years. Before I start, I forgot. Since I'm chairman of the media accuracy group Honest Reporting, I caution you that these are my personal opinions and do not represent those of Honest Reporting. That being said, please allow Honest Reporting please follow Honest Reporting in your social media, and if you can, please contribute. People jump to hasty conclusions based on their internal biases and poor reporting. It's your job as citizens to do better, and our job on Honest Reporting is to help you do better. Okay, so the Fourth Geneva Convention is the source of most of the current law on war, and a lot of what I discuss is going to be derived from there. But why are the laws of war even important? Russia doesn't follow them in their rape of Ukraine. Hamas doesn't follow them in their genocide that they've committed last week. But laws of war are important to civilized nations. They help maintain the moral high ground. And even though the press and expert commentators often don't know what they were talking about when they talk about the laws of war, proportionality, and they just speak silliness. You need to understand the laws of war if you're going to be a good consumer, like I just said, of the news and a good citizen. Um, International laws of war involve a lot of balancing acts, but Hamas's widespread and systematic attack on the Israeli civilian population last week was clearly an act of ethnic cleansing, genocide, and constitute crimes against humanity, which is the highest level of war crimes. If this case ever goes to The Hague, which I'm sure it won't, those legal conclusions are backed by Hamas's own video, documentation, and stated intentions. It's really shows their disrespect or disregard, lack of awareness that they laid all that out for us. But this was an intentional attack on civilians to cause the maximum suffering. It's an open and shut case of savagery and crime against humanity. So that's a bygone conclusion. But as this war heats up and Israel goes on the offensive, let me go back to some basic tenets of the laws of war from the Fourth Geneva Convention. Okay, first, most critically, responsibility for a population rests on the occupying power of a territory. And the occupying power is pretty much the way it sounds. The United States is the occupying power of the United States. It's been pretty firmly established that Israel is not the occupying power of Gaza, but Hamas is. Israel evacuated Gaza in 2005. In 2006, democratic elections were held in which the Gazan population elected Hamas to run their government, and they've held on to power ever since. Maybe forcefully, but they run Gaza. While Israel has kept a semi-closed border with Gaza, allowing food and fuel and workers to go back and forth, which of course the workers ended up, some of them were spying and creating the roadmap for the attacks last Saturday. In spite of that, let's just say Israel had a fully closed border with Gaza, which it doesn't. Gaza still has a fourth border with Egypt that Israel does not control, and through which goods, people, anything can travel. So between Hamas being the elected government and administering Gaza as a government, and the Egyptian border being open, any allegations that Israel is in control or is an occupying power of Gaza is ridiculous. That fourth border of Egypt just shoots that, any remnant of a specious argument that Israel is the occupying power, just shoots it in the head. Hamas is in control. Okay, so since Israel is not the occupying power of Gaza, its responsibilities with regard to the population of Gaza are very limited, and I'll describe them later. But it's important to note that Israel's obligations to Gaza and its residents under international law are not dependent on reciprocity, just the obligations of a non-occupying power under international law. Again, I'll go through those in a bit. As for the conduct of war, let's talk about the conduct of war. Generally speaking, military strikes should attack military targets. They should not attack purely civilian targets. What about civilian targets that are used for military purposes? Those are valid targets in the conduct of war. And the responsibility for civilian targets used for military purpose is, once again, on the occupying power, the power that's in control of those assets, of those civilian facilities, and is able to make use of them as military targets. They are responsible, okay? As a result, any casualties that come from attacks on those civilian targets that are used for military purposes, any of those casualties are the responsibility under international law of the occupying power, subject to, that's generally subject to the rules of proportionality and other rules I'll talk about in a second. So Hamas puts rocket launchers in a mosque and either fires from the mosque or stores the rockets in that mosque, which is otherwise a civilian thing. Israel attacks that mosque within the general accordance of the rules of law. Any civilian deaths that occur are basically laid at the hands of Hamas for making that a military target. Okay, I mean, I'm saying it again and again and again, but this is something that the media and various politicians just either don't grasp or don't want to grasp. We know that Hamas puts rockets in UN relief agency schools all the time. The UN has admitted finding weapons and rockets in their schools, and they must have been so shocked that they found them there. And we know that Hamas places its main command post for its government and for its military under the Al-Shufra hospital in bunkers that were created a long time ago, a civilian hospital. And we'll get to, based on the latest news today, we'll get to that idea in a second. It wasn't at the Al-Shufra hospital that the tragedy happened today. It was another hospital, but we'll talk about that in a second. It's the most cynical, horrible, uncivilized thing to do, and yet they do it. And the media has reported for years on the Al-Shufra hospital bunkers. They talk about meeting government officials there. But I don't know. Anyway, let's talk about proportionality. Proportionality is not a comparison of body count. Okay, so when you hear people say, "Oh, Israel only lost 3 people in the last set of rocket attacks last year or 2 years ago because the Iron Dome was so great," and how can Israel go in and kill 500 Gazans, 500 Hamas people in Gaza? That's not proportional. That's not what proportionality is. It's not a comparison of body count. Rather, it means that civilian casualties should not be excessive to the military benefit that's reasonably expected to be obtained from an attack. Okay, so let me say that again. Civilian casualties should not be excessive to the military benefit reasonably expected to be obtained from an attack. And that's based on information available to commanders at the time they attack. There's no 20/20 hindsight on this. If a commander believes that there are 10 people in a house that houses a top Hamas commander, or let's use that as an example, okay? they've turned that into a military asset. Um, proportionality doesn't count how many military people die versus how many civilian people die. The occupying power turned that into a target. And if it was reasonable and necessary for the execution of the war effort to take out that Hamas commander, that's what you look at. And I'll talk a little later about warnings and all of that stuff, but just hold on to that for a second. Um, and again, if it ends up that there were 100 people in the house, not the 10 that the Israeli commander thought was there, you're not supposed to judge on the fact that 100 people were in the house. You're supposed to judge on what he knew at that time, or reasonably knew at that time, that there were 10 people there. And I know this is very macabre, and it just seems very slide rule-like, but that's what the laws of war are. Okay, they're give and take. They're attempting to strike a reasonable balance, particularly when you have immoral people hiding behind civilians. Okay, that brings us to the issue of reasonableness and warning of impending combat to civilians. So these are like related concepts. You need to balance military necessity against humanitarian considerations. So that basically requires that you give advanced warning of attack. If there are civilians in harm's way, you try to give advanced warning of attack when feasible, depending upon the risks and the objectives. So let's use some examples, okay? Number one, let's say there's a house, a civilian house, and it comes to Israeli intelligence that there are rockets in the basement. They're not primed to fire. They're being stored in the basement, okay? And it will take a half hour to get them upstairs to the roof to actually fire, okay? And that's the information the Israeli commander has at that moment, right? Remember, it's based on what you know, not on what you'll find out later. In that situation, there's time to warn civilians to evacuate, and you could still destroy the rockets. You have, say you got 10 minutes to get out, and Israel does this. They'll use door knocker bombs, duds that they drop on a roof that warn people get the hell out of the house, or they'll send texts to all the people in the house saying get out now, and they have the ability to get out. Again, if they stay in the house, or if Hamas keeps them in the house against their will, to be casualties, to be, basically almost, to become collateral damage, but not collateral damage, to become a PR win for them. Hamas is the occupying power. Hamas is responsible. But in those situations, you have time to give the civilians time to get out, and not be human shields. So, you do that. But let's take scenario number two. A Hamas commander is hiding in a civilian house among civilians. He's using them clearly as a human shield. Okay? Any warning given to civilians in that house would give the Hamas commander opportunity to evacuate. So what does Israel do? Are they allowed to, or do they have to warn the civilians in the house to get out at the risk of losing the Hamas target? They do not. Okay, under international law. And you listen. In reality, the commander is going to judge how essential is that commander. If it's like a senior guy, by definition, that's going to tilt the balance towards attacking and killing civilians. If it's just a junior guy, they probably won't. And so that's a scenario of again, risk of executing the military mission versus risk of civilian casualties, and can you give warning, can you not give warning? And it's unfortunate, but that's how it is. I mean, listen, in our fight against ISIS in Syria and Iraq, we killed an estimated, there were an estimated 10,000 civilian casualties, many of whom came from our warfighting manner. Okay, I'm talking as an American, our U.S. warfighting manner. Between Afghanistan and Iraq, in those two main wars, forget about the ISIS part, close to 500,000 civilians died. Okay. Um, you know, and that was in and during U.S. military and allied military operations. Barack Obama was the great user of drones, aerial drones, to get terrorists from the sky. And many weddings of civilized people and other gatherings of civilized people were attacked. The decisions were made at the time that the balance of warning versus executing a valid military strategy, were such that those attacks had to happen, and those civilian casualties were unfortunately reasonable collateral damage from executing a warfighting strategy against, frankly, an evil enemy as Israel faces today. So again, I kind of had to not double standard this, but apply consistent rules in both cases. Israel cannot live by one set of rules, and our allies live by another set of rules. So anyway, um, now in the news, just this moment, and I don't know what's going on right now, is this hospital that got bombed or that blew up, or we don't know what. Hamas is, of course, saying an Israeli aerial attack bombed this hospital, killed 500 people in Gaza. It's not the Al Shufra hospital; it's another one I haven't heard of. Frankly, we don't know what happened. There's a fog of war thing going on right now. I find it surprising if Israel would attack a hospital the day before President Biden is coming, knowing how sensitive he is about the civilian casualty aspect, in spite of everything I've just said about the rules of war, and in spite of American behavior in recent wars. Okay, but I find it doubtful that they would purposefully bomb a hospital. There are other theories as of this moment that are going on. Theory that a rocket, a Gazan rocket fell short. There were rocket barrages from Gaza, from that vicinity, going on right when the hospital got hit. So, and these rockets do fall short. Could be arms stored in the hospital, again against international law, could have detonated. It could be there was a nearby target that Israel hit legitimately that blew up, and the explosion was greater than anticipated, and it took out the hospital. And again, it's based on what you reasonably knew at the time, not on what actually happened. Um, so, there are a lot of potential explanations. I don't know. I'd like to see more details and see what happened. It very well could be, by the way, if Israel did do it, very well could be that, you know, I can't see Israel doing it unless it was like war ending, especially right before Biden comes, you know. But I'll give you an example. It could be, what if the senior Hamas leadership were all meeting in that hospital at that moment in time, and Israel had the option of basically decapitating Hamas leadership and essentially ending the war by hitting that hospital. Under the standards I gave a couple of minutes ago, would that have been a valid reason for hitting that hospital? Forget about the fact that as occupying power, Hamas would be responsible for the damage that happened there if they put that hospital in harm's way. Would that have been a valid reason to hit that hospital? For sure. So again, I don't know. It could be a giant screw up by the Israelis. It could be, I doubt very, very, very highly it was just, a cold-blooded attempt to kill civilians. There are easier ways for the Israelis to do that if they were like that. Um, it's not in their interest to have done this right before Biden came. So, we'll see. Okay, I would not jump to conclusions. Um, so anyway, now let's talk about the duty to minimize civilian casualties, which is kind of a corollary to some of what I've just been talking about. But the occupying power, Hamas, is responsible for reasonably minimizing the odds of civilian casualties. And how do you do that? You relocate civilian populations where feasible, okay? Um, you don't interfere with transport of civilians. And obviously, you can't use civilians as human shields or their property, like their residences for military use, okay? So if Hamas ignores these rules, as they have for years and years, and they even were urging people not to evacuate to the south, as Israel gave the plan. They texted, they dropped maps, they showed people evacuation routes. They've been begging them to move to the south, to evacuate to the south. They've also been begging for the hospitals to evacuate, for the same reasons, because as I said, Hamas hides in hospitals. It's what they do. So, again, if Hamas ignores all of that, and we also saw pictures of Hamas blocking exit roads, north-south exit roads from Gaza City with trucks. So they're trying to keep the civilians in, to essentially be human shields, to make it harder for Israel to fight. So again, Hamas ignores these rules as they have. They're responsible for war crimes, for the death of their own civilians. The attacking power is not responsible as long as they follow the rules of proportionality I described, not the bogus ones that the media uses. 3 of yours dead, 3 of mine dead. Or, the squad uses that theory too. And, by the way, that duty of an occupying power to reasonably minimize civilian casualties is why the Israeli government, as the occupying power of Israel, has moved over the last week roughly 100,000 civilians from the Gaza envelope and the northern border region, out of these continuous, out of the contiguous space to the war zones, because, that's their duty, to protect the population and to move them out of, harm's way. That's what civilized people do anyway, and that's what international law requires governments to do. So again, just to summarize this, advanced warning and proportionality in practice is, when attacking Gaza with the intent of defeating a military enemy, the Hamas Gaza state, Israel's supposed to take reasonable precautions balanced against the reasonably anticipated level of benefits from a successful military operation. And they do all that to minimize civilian casualties. I gave you some of the warning stuff, the evacuation corridor, distribution of information for evacuation, all of that stuff Israel does. Now let's talk about kind of the last piece of this, which is siege law. Particularly dealing with the food, the water, etc. We've read about that. Israel closed off. No country in the world ever, I gotta believe, has ever fed and provided water and fuel to an enemy state with which it's in current combat. Okay, find me one. Okay, I really doubt it. That's like us being at war with Germany during World War II and selling them fuel, water, and food. In fact, that's how World War II started. Okay, we cut off the Japanese from fuel. So in any event, so first, remember, Israel is a non-occupying power in Gaza. They do not occupy Gaza. As a non-occupying power, Israel is generally not responsible for providing food, water, fuel, etc. provisions to Gaza, either for its citizens or for Hamas, as you would expect. So that's no responsibility. Okay. Now, there has been some confusion in 2007. Remember, I said that Hamas was elected in 2006, Israel left in 2005. In 2007, Israel's High Court had a ruling prohibiting the military from cutting off fuel and water from Gaza. And they said it on human rights grounds. Israel couldn't stop providing those things to Gaza, but their decision was based on the specific facts that are long past. Um, that because Israel was the occupying power until 2006, Gaza was dependent upon Israel and didn't have the opportunity to develop its own abilities. So, from 67 to 2006, Gaza was, you know, under Israeli control as the occupying power. So the Israeli court said, listen, they need some time to develop their own abilities to produce water, food, blah, 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 and remembering that the southern border with Egypt is another border with another country that they can get all those things from, right? Um, so that case might have been relevant in 2007, but it's been 16 years. Gaza has had its own government and time to develop its own capabilities, including they have desalinization plants, they have a sufficient aquifer, water aquifer that unfortunately they've polluted, which is remarkable how they've done that. They have wastewater treatment. Go to Honest Reporting. We posted something the other day. It was a Hamas propaganda video that showed them literally pulling pipes out of the ground that had been supplied by Israel for water carriage and also waste treatment carriage. And they would Hamas took the pipes out of the ground, and they were, waving the flag and bragging that they were going to turn these pipes into Qassam rockets to fire at Israel. So, I'm not responsible for that. You're not responsible for that. They're responsible for that. They had the ability, and, unfortunately, they are where they are now because of the actions of their own government. And again, no nation at war has ever been responsible for feeding and supplying its military enemy. It's ridiculous, with one exception. The rules of siege. Okay? If Israel controlled all four borders of Gaza and its air, which it does control its air, then Israel would have certain responsibilities for the protection of civilians from a full-out siege. Again, Egypt remains in control of Gaza's southern border. It's a third country. It's not under Israel's control. So, frankly, there is no siege. Okay, now the problem is the Egyptians don't want to have anything to do with Gaza and Hamas. It's a pox on everyone's house, and to some extent, I don't know. It's speculation of what's going on. It's in any event. Let's go back to what Israel's responsibility is if it controlled that last border. Okay, and listen, many of us have felt Israel should go into the Philadelphia corridor, which is the bottom of Gaza, right up against the Egyptian border, and control that border immediately, and near Rafah, because as long as as long as Hamas has our people as hostages, as captives, you know, that's a human rights violation by them. We have the right to totally cut them off from the world. But let's talk about what the law is for a second. Under the rules of siege, let's say Israel controlled all four borders. Let's say Israel did exactly what I just said they should do, and they controlled all four borders. Under the rules of siege, if there are civilians in Gaza, Israel does have the responsibility to permit other parties to bring in essential food and water and humanitarian aid just for the civilians, not for the Hamas military people. Okay? But there are two conditions. Israel can apply reasonable conditions to search of the supplies to ensure that no military use items come through on those trucks and no combatants are smuggled into Gaza. So that's number one, reasonable condition to search the supplies. The second thing is Israel can demand as a condition to that the distribution of those supplies be by a neutral agency, not by Hamas, and that the supplies not go to combatants. Now, we already heard yesterday that some supplies got in, I think through Egypt, I'm not sure, and that Hamas took them. Okay, they were supposed to be for civilians. So if Israel enforces a full-fledged all-border siege, they still have to provide for the civilians. Now, again, this gets back to Israel saying, we want all the civilians from Gaza City and from the northern part of Gaza to go down to the south through the evacuation corridor that we've established for them so that they can be fed and taken care of by refugee agencies. Okay? To the extent that they are willing to allow those civilians to be fed and taken care of by third parties, and they ensure that none of that aid goes to Hamas combatants, Israel's fulfilling its requirements under international law. And there's no reason to believe that Israel wouldn't. So when bold statements are made in the media about that, okay, that Israel's not, and the Israelis will do it because they're not sensitive to words either. Okay, a lot of the Israeli spokesmen, Israelis, they're pissed off, they're furious, they want blood, but they'll say, you'll see some spokesmen that will say they don't get food until we get our captives back, which morally feels fair enough. The rules of law requires that they permit food to civilians in the civilian refugee areas, and I'm sure that Israel will do that. They just don't want anything going to Hamas. And if Hamas keeps civilians in Gaza City as human shields, again, Israel's not responsible for those civilians because the occupying power has kept them there. The occupying power, Hamas, is responsible for them. One last thing, and then I'll go. Rules on abductees. Okay, very simple. Civilian hostages must be released unconditionally. It's mandatory and immediately. Anything else is just a plain out war crime. And while in the Arab world, the taking of hostages is kind of a thing. For that matter, the Muslim world. I mean, Turkey is not Arab, but they do the same thing. Actually, all dictators seem to do it. Iran does it too. They're not Arabs either. Our stupidity is that they take hostages and we'll trade something for them, so we just encourage them to do it next time. But bottom line is, under the rule of war, the taking of civilian hostages is a war crime. Period. End of story. And that's it. And it further rationalizes and gives basis for Israel's action during a war that we're about to see. So anyway, listen. Hopefully, this hospital thing that happened today isn't as bad as it was. Hopefully, when the facts come out, we find out that it was, either exploded ordnance that was there already, or maybe Islamic Jihad did it, or who knows what. I find it very, very hard to believe that Israel intentionally bombed that hospital with no valid military target there. I mean, it's impossible to conceive of. It's just the Israeli army, you have to understand, is run by lawyers. I mean, they're in the operation rooms when decisions like that are made. So it's inconceivable. Okay. Anyway, listen. Thanks very much. My next one of these should be pretty interesting. We'll see what happens. I mean, I might wait till after the invasion actually starts. I mean, we already heard from a friend of mine that his wife was informed by their son on the Gaza border that they're going off base now and they're going offline. So, that means, it's soon. Biden's in Israel tomorrow, and then we'll see what happens. Okay. Thanks very much for listening. Pass this on to your friends. Please follow Honest Reporting. And also, if you want information, go to my Facebook page. I put stuff up all the time. And sorry for this amateurish setup I have, but this is where I live until I get back to Israel. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.